Here's what to know before seeing the Odyssey. Christopher Nolan's latest movie is an adaptation of the epic ancient Greek poem that is attributed to Homer, not him. Traditionally, Homer is said to have written both the Iliad and the Odyssey, but we say it's attributed to him because these stories are so old, one of the oldest works of literature we have, that there's lots of theories and possibilities about where they actually come from. Scholars are pretty sure that they started as oral tradition, meaning they were passed down from one generation to the next just by telling the story verbally. The actual written work might have even been written by multiple people or even groups of people over time, but to keep it simple, we say they're by Homer. Now, another thing that tends to trip people up is the question of whether these stories are historical or pieces of ancient Greek mythology, and the answer is kind of both. Ultimately, the story itself that spans both the Iliad and the Odyssey is myth. The ancient Greek gods are personified characters that get directly involved in the conflicts and affect the events of the story. Not to mention, there's also mythical creatures. That said, the setting of these stories are heavily influenced by places and cultures that did exist in history. Roughly around 1200 BC, the city of Troy, where the Iliad takes place, was actually thought to be a fictional city until an excavation revealed ruins of a city that matched its description and location in 1871. This led to the belief that the stories told by Homer were rooted in at least some historical truth. These stories have been adapted many times and in many unique ways. Just to name a few, the 2004 movie Troy aimed to present an adaptation of the Iliad with a more historic feel, shifting the focus away from the gods.
Apollo sees everything. Perhaps it is not wise to offend him.
And Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a very loose adaptation of the Odyssey that reimagines the setting as the American South in the late 1930s.
I generally refrain from speech during gustation. I find it coarse and vulgar. Where were we?
Making money in the Lord's service.
Now, even though Nolan's movie is called The Odyssey, it's tough to know how much of the story he'll also include from the Iliad or other sources. For instance, we keep seeing the famous Trojan horse in all of the marketing, but that event doesn't actually happen in the Iliad or the Odyssey. It happens between them. Our main source for the story of the Trojan horse is the Aeneid, written by the Roman poet Virgil around 19 BC. The Trojan horse is referenced in the Odyssey as if it's something the audience would already know. So Virgil didn't make it up, but he likely adapted the story from other Greek literature that has since been lost. So we don't know how much Nolan is including in his version of the Odyssey, but theoretically it should pick up sometime after the events of the Iliad. And the Iliad starts all because of Menelaus, Paris, and Helen. And yes, I'm using the movie Troy as a reference so we can keep the characters straight. At this point, Greece is not yet a unified civilization, it's a bunch of smaller kingdoms. For instance, Odysseus rules over Ithaca. Menelaus is the king of Sparta. But they and all the other kings have been unified under the leadership of Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae. Across the Aegean Sea is the city of Troy, ruled by King Priam. One of Priam's sons, Paris, journeys to Sparta pretending to be on a diplomatic mission. But really, he's there to romantically pursue Menelaus' wife, Helen, who's supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the world.
Princes of Troy, Queen Helen and I salute you.
Paris does this because he has been promised love by the goddess Aphrodite after he deemed her to be the most beautiful goddess and gifted her a golden apple. Now, in some versions of the story, Helen falls in love with Paris and goes willingly. In others, she's kidnapped. Either way, she is taken from Sparta all the way back to Troy and then becomes known as Helen of Troy. Menelaus then invokes a previous oath that says all of the kingdoms must protect Helen. So Menelaus' brother and ruler of all the kingdoms, Agamemnon, leads a huge army to Troy where they start a siege that lasts 10 years. And all of this happens before the Iliad even starts. The Iliad takes place in the final year of the 10-year siege. At this point in the story, Agamemnon insults his best warrior, Achilles. So Achilles refuses to allow himself or his army to continue fighting in what has become the Trojan War. Paris volunteers to try and end the war with a duel between him and Menelaus. Whoever wins will get to marry Helen and the war can end. Menelaus wins the duel, but Aphrodite rescues Paris before he dies. So the war continues and the gods get very involved, with different gods and goddesses fighting for the side they prefer. It becomes this really epic battle of both divine power and mortal heroes. At one point, Zeus, leader of the gods, commands the rest of Olympus to stop intervening, but Hera lulls him to sleep so that Poseidon can help Agamemnon's army. This makes Zeus really mad, but he reminds everyone that it doesn't matter because Troy is fated to fall as long as one specific event happens. And it involves Hector, Paris' older brother, and Patroclus, Achilles' companion, or more likely, his lover. To allow Achilles' army to return to the fight, Patroclus leads them to battle wearing Achilles' armor so everybody thinks Achilles has returned as well. There's a huge battle, but it ends when Patroclus is slain by Hector. This is so devastating to Achilles that he goes to get revenge on Hector, even though he knows that he is fated to die if he slays Hector. So Hector and Achilles go to duel, but Achilles is so terrifying that Hector actually runs away, and Achilles chases him around the city. Athena eventually stops Hector by tricking him with a vision of his brother, which allows Achilles to catch up. They have their duel, and Achilles wins pretty easily, then disrespects Hector's body by dragging it behind his chariot. The story ends when Achilles and Hector's father, King Priam, have a heart-to-heart.
You're still my enemy tonight, but even enemies can show respect.
And Achilles agrees to give the body back so they can mourn Hector properly. Now the Odyssey picks up after Agamemnon's forces have won the Trojan War and Odysseus is trying to return home. So obviously there's a big gap between these two stories. For instance, we have the famous Achilles heel. In one of the battles, Achilles makes it inside the gates of Troy, but is shot in the heel by Paris with a poisoned arrow. This causes Achilles to die when other wounds would not, because his mother, a nymph named Thetis, had dipped him in the river Styx as a baby to make him invincible, but held him by his heel. More battles and several plots happened as a result of the death of Achilles, but the war finally comes to an end thanks to none other than Odysseus. He comes up with a plan to build a giant wooden horse. They know that the horse is sacred to the Trojans, and they leave an inscription on it saying it's an offering to Athena so that they can finally return home.
The Greeks are praying for a safe return home. I hope the sea god spits in their offering. Lets them all drown at the bottom of the sea.
The Trojans think the war is over and take the horse inside their city until they decide what to do with it. Several characters think it's a terrible idea to keep the horse, but because it's technically sacred, others disagree. Then during the night, the soldiers hiding in the horse sack the city of Troy, wiping out many of the sleeping citizens. They end up burning the city and committing a lot of other horrible war crimes, many of which offend the gods. This makes it so that many of the members of Agamemnon's army do not return safely home. Which brings us to the Odyssey. After 10 long years of war, Odysseus and his men are seeking to sail back across the Aegean Sea to return home to the island of Ithaca. But the question is, will their sins during the Trojan War haunt them as they go? Will the gods allow them to return safely, or will they curse them? And what has been happening back in Odysseus' home while he's been away? That's the setup for the narrative, but what can we expect from Christopher Nolan's version of this story? Nolan loves old-style Hollywood filmmaking and tries to use practical effects, costumes, and locations as much as possible. So we can expect to see plenty of in-camera effects supplemented by CGI. He also has been a huge supporter of the IMAX format, which has a much taller aspect ratio than standard theatrical formats. It creates a bigger vertical picture specifically meant for theatrical viewing, and this will be the first commercial movie shot entirely in the IMAX format. Some people have noticed in the film's trailers that the characters seem to be speaking in modern English.
My dad is coming home.
It can sound weird initially, but there's a specific reason for it. Nolan used several different translations of the Odyssey to inspire his version of the story, but one of them in particular is really interesting, and it's by Emily Wilson. She deliberately used simple, modern language in her translation. When Homer, or whoever it was, wrote the Odyssey, it was intended for contemporary audiences, so its language would have likely sounded normal to the people at the time. Hollywood has a history of giving a specific kind of speech to any film that takes place in ancient history. It usually involves a more refined version of English with modern words kept to a minimum, and the actors usually speak with a vaguely British accent.
The man has no honor. I won't be remembered as a tyrant's master.
And we as audiences have grown accustomed to associating that with ancient history, even though the way they're speaking in the movies is no closer to what they would have been speaking anciently than the modern language we have now. It just helps to maintain an illusion of a different time. So like Emily Wilson, Nolan has decided to do away with that and just have the characters speak as we would, as if the story has been translated specifically for our time. So with all of this in mind, I'd love to hear what you think. Are you excited for the Odyssey? Let me know.